Hey, well, thank you all for joining today. Really happy to see you all here. We're very excited about our presentation today and our co-hosting with Wild Birds Unlimited. And we will dive in here and start the presentation. Really excited to have Brian Cunningham joining us from Wild Birds Unlimited. He's my co-host today, and he is going to help facilitate questions. So I'm trying to tell on Zoom, but we're going to move ahead with that and introduce our presenters. So we're very, very, very happy to have our presenters from National Wildlife Federation, Corina Newsome and John Kanter. Corina is a conservation scientist with National Wildlife Federation, and John is a senior biologist. I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a minute. I just realized I need to introduce myself. I'm Mary Phillips. I'm the head of Garden for Wildlife and the Certified Wildlife Habitat Program at National Wildlife Federation, and really happy to be hosting today. And we've got a great program for you. We're going to dive into in a second. Brian, do you mind introducing yourself and telling folks a little bit about your background? And then Corina and John, if you could do the same after Brian. Thanks.
Certainly, yes. Brian Cunningham. I'm the Director of Outreach and Nature Education with Wild Birds Unlimited, backyard bird feeding company. I've been with Wild Birds Unlimited for over 26 years. And so I help the stores to be the local experts among a lot of other things. So glad to be here today.
Thanks so much. Corina.
Hi, everyone. As Mary said, I'm a conservation scientist at National Wildlife Federation. My background is in bird science, bird ecology, so this conversation is very exciting to me. And I've had the privilege of working both in the research sector of avian conservation as well as in community engagement, thinking a lot about how bird conservation, particularly for our migratory birds, also can greatly benefit some of our most environmentally vulnerable human communities as well. And I'm excited to talk a little bit more about that. Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Corina. John?
Yeah, hi everyone. John Kanter. I'm the senior wildlife biologist at National Wildlife Federation, where I've been for almost 6 years now, and I split my time between my home here in New Hampshire and our office in Washington, D.C. I spent most of my career as the head of the non-game and endangered species program for the state of New Hampshire. And that's where I do most of my bird watching and bird feeding.
Thanks, John. I wanted to let everyone know we're really encouraging people to put any questions they have in the Q&A area of the Zoom bar there, and we will be gathering those questions and answering them at the end. And I'm going to kick off and tell you guys a little bit about Garden for Wildlife and the Certified Wildlife Habitat Program. And then Brian's going to share a little bit about Wild Birds Unlimited, and then we're going to get into the panel and presentation discussion. So really excited, as I said, to have everyone here, particularly because this is our 50th year for Garden for Wildlife, and having a little bit of a challenge for some reason with moving these slides along. There we go. So Garden for Wildlife is America's largest and longest running native plant habitat movement. It started in 1973, and it's very specific to helping wildlife thrive where people live, work, play, learn, and worship. And we're, like I said, we're very excited that this is our 50th year, and that we are actually trying to really get many more people to create this kind of habitat. And we have some great goals for this year. Yes, so here's the scope of our Certified Wildlife Habitat Program. We actually are at 288,700. I did the slide last week, and we've already gotten so many more in the door this last week. So really, really excited to see. I just checked that right before we got on the call today. And it's across North America and at 38 embassies across the world. So it's a really growing program, which we're really, really excited about the scale and scope and impact. And this is kind of a sense of where it is throughout the United States. It's obviously the largest concentration of certified wildlife habitats are across the United States. And of that, over 10,000 of those are schoolyard habitats. And 90% of certified wildlife habitats are primarily residential. And yeah, so the other thing is that our network's really expanded. And one of the reasons I'm sharing this slide is for those of you on the call that are in some of these states, you also have local resources. We have a network of 26 of our National Wildlife Federation state affiliates that do many things around promoting the creation of habitat. They obviously encourage people to create certified wildlife habitats. They host native plant sales. They partner with local Wild Birds Unlimited stores, many of them, in doing workshops and all sorts of other events. So wanted to make sure you knew those resources were there in your states. One of the things I mentioned, this is our 50th anniversary, and this program and this need to create habitat and National Wildlife Federation's role in this really goes back to research done back in 1972 by two U.S. Forest Service researchers that showed the tools that wildlife managers use on large landscapes and public lands to do habitat restoration by providing the elements of food, water, cover, and places to raise young, also actually work on smaller scale backyards, and actually showed the impact on wildlife at the time. So back at that time, National Wildlife looked at this research, was in conversations with these researchers, and decided to develop the Backyard Habitat Program, which is what the Certified Wildlife Habitat Program was called back then. And that was launched through a national campaign that was part of articles in our National Wildlife magazine. So we just celebrated the anniversary. It started in 1973. So we're excited about that and excited about the growth since then. As I mentioned, the elements of any certified wildlife habitat and any good bird habitat, obviously, is food, water, cover, and places for wildlife to raise young. And the presenters will touch on aspects of how these components are part of creating good habitat as we move forward. And the other really key thing are sustainable practices. At the end of this presentation, we do have a summary slide and resources to get more information for creating bird-friendly habitat. One of the things that's really important about why we have this program is that it was started in research, and also now 50 years later, there's even more research that shows that properties that have these elements of habitat, and there's been studies on certified wildlife habitats that actually show the increase in wildlife numbers on these kinds of properties versus properties that aren't installing these elements. And one of the really key ones is a paper that was published by Ecological Applications, and it talked about a study of 15 scientists that worked to look at residential yard management in suburban urban areas around some of these key 6 metro areas. And from that study, they compared all these different spaces, including the certified wildlife habitat yards. And one of the things that they found is, sorry, this little arrow is just not, it sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So they were studying all the different types of wildlife in those areas, also soil, carbon, and other kinds of impacts on those properties. And one of the things that they found was that yard over yard is that you could see in the certified wildlife habitat properties greater instances of diversity of birds. Each yard, the turnover per yard that they studied showed a real great diversity of bird species, and of course abundance of bird species. And that was compared to the non-certified yards that really only showed often the same species. Many of those are not native. And they were very limited compared to the richness and the diversity and the abundance of the certified yards. So I wanted to kick off this event today to really help people understand there's so much that you can do that we're going to touch on today that has real impact, and it has been studied. So I think it's just very encouraging that you doing these practices and creating this bird-friendly habitat. We'll find out more why when we look at the state of the birds, of why this is so important, but I really wanted to get that message out there that you truly can make a substantial difference in this space. So I want to move ahead here. And again, I apologize. What's going on? One thing I wanted to mention is the habitat that's created and putting all these elements, and particularly using native plants, is really important because 96% of backyard birds actually rely on invertebrates for their food and for feeding their young. So we're going to talk more about how creating this habitat can support that, but that's a really key point to just keep in mind throughout this episode today. Keystone plants are a key source of these insects, particularly butterflies and moths, that can support these birds. So we'll touch on that later too. I'm going to turn it over to Brian right now to talk a little bit about Wild Birds Unlimited.
All right, thank you. Yeah, go ahead and you can click to the next slide. Just Wild Birds Unlimited, if you're not familiar, is a backyard bird feeding company. We're specialty retail. We're the experts in the backyard bird feeding realm. Our mission is to bring people and nature together, and we've been doing this for over 40 years. All of our stores are franchised operations. We're throughout US and Canada. You can see on the slide a number of stores. We continue to grow and being able to make deeper connections across North America, bringing that bird feeding hobby and having those connections and partnerships. And Mary already alluded to, a lot of our stores work with the state affiliates for National Wildlife Federation, those state wildlife federations, and lots of other partnerships to be in the community, helping to do one thing is save the songbirds. Wild Birds Unlimited, we have been in connection with National Wildlife Federation for a long time. We rekindled our partnership with a specific scenario just recently in 2020 to be the champions for the National Wildlife Federation's Certified Wildlife Habitat Program. When I started with Wild Birds Unlimited back 26 years ago, we were selling the predecessor to this program. They were habitat certification packets. We were selling those in the store for National Wildlife Federation. So exciting to see how so much is coming full circle. We have been able to, just in the last couple of years, where we know of over 2,200 certifications at people's homes for certified wildlife habitats. And pretty exciting, we have over 40 of our stores outside of their space. That is a certified habitat area. And then our franchise support center, which supports all of our stores, over half of us have already been able to certify our personal yards. So really exciting to see that growth and that continue to help the birds and wildlife. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So another big aspect of what we're doing, which is in conjunction with today, the state of the birds. We created an initiative called Save the Songbirds, which has become a part of our DNA throughout the Wild Birds Unlimited stores. It's part of our vision and values now, where many of our stores are also taking hold of this and doing things where they're creating songbird hero programs that if you certify your yard, you get all sorts of benefits in the store for being very conscious and taking action right there at home. Some of them you can see in the slide in the middle are actually going so far as to putting your name up on a board as a songbird hero. Really exciting. We do a lot with selling native plants. Stores, we've been doing that for a long time. We're trying to actually make that a initiative across US and Canada. We have a 9-state program right now that we're piloting this spring, which is really very exciting to be able to have native plants available that you can plant right in your own yard that are just right for your particular area. So we're trying to make that bigger and be able, like I said, have that throughout US and Canada. We also have our podcast, Nature Centered. I'm one of the co-hosts. We talk about habitat all the time. We allude to it constantly. We've had David Mizejewski, the naturalist for National Wildlife Federation. He's been a guest a few times talking about this very concept, this whole focus. So we've been doing a lot of things to be able to help save the songbirds and really get people connected. So I'm excited to dive in today and hear the state of the birds and what you can do at home.
Thank you so much. I am going to move us forward here. And Brian, you are going to do the first question to Corina. Oops, that's for later.
There you go.
I will stop sharing and Corina will share.
All right. Well, Corina, we'll let you get settled there. And for everyone, we're going to go through some Q&A, bouncing back and forth, where Corina and John will help address some of these things that are going on. But Corina, to toss out that first question for you, why is there an urgency to create more safe spaces and support a greater number of bird populations overall? Tell us what's going on.
Thanks, Brian. That's a great question. And thanks again for having us. I am going to be referencing a recently published report called the State of the Birds Report, which was released in the fall of 2022. So fresh off the press, and I'll be putting the link to that in the chat in just a little bit so that you can check it out. But you may be aware, of course, that a lot of birds across, I should say, North America have been experiencing serious declines. And actually in 2019, a study was published that found that we have about 3 billion fewer birds flying across our skies here in the US than we did 50 years ago, which is not a long time ago. And so those declines, that large number, was very alarming. And to break down what some of those declines have actually looked like, when it comes to grassland birds, we have 53% population loss across bird species that are categorized as grassland birds. And for example, when it comes to eastern meadowlarks, 3 and 4 have been lost since 1970. When it comes to migratory birds, so birds that spend one part of their year in the north and one part in the south, when it comes to the hemispheric traveling that they do twice a year, we've had a 28% decrease in populations of migratory birds across the United States. When thinking about aerial insectivores, so some of those very acrobatic birds that we love to watch, especially in the summertime, that are thankfully eating a lot of the mosquitoes and other insects that share our spaces with us, we've seen 32% population loss since 1970 when it comes to those birds. And so these numbers are very alarming, right? When you hear these losses, it can kind of strike a chord when it comes to like our possible hopelessness for the future. I want to urge you to not hang on to hopelessness, though. We're painting this picture for you because there are things that we are doing and can continue to do to address these declines. So in the State of the Birds report, here is a little graph that essentially breaks down by habitat the bird losses that have happened in the past approximately 50 years. So if you look at arid land birds, eastern forest birds, sea ducks, right? So it categorizes birds here. There is a downward trend pretty much for all habitat types. Except for water birds. We're not going to touch too much on that today. They actually saw an increase when it comes to wetland habitats, particularly species like ducks and geese and things like that, because of investment in conservation. So they're a win. They're an example of what happens when we take the time to invest in conservation action for birds. But I'm going to zero in here on what are called tipping point species. I'll define what that means in just a second, but they're that bottom lowest line. And there is a 67% decline in what are called tipping point species. And these species are birds that have lost half of their populations in the last 50 years. So their populations have been cut in half in the last 50 years, and they are likely 70 of those species are also expected to lose another half of their population in the next 50 years. So there are 90 tipping points or 90 species that have already lost half, and 70 of those are likely to lose another half if action is not taken on their behalf. And some examples of these species that are categorized as tipping point species include species from a variety of different kinds of ecosystems: bobolink, which depend on grasslands, albatross, greater sage grouse that live in arid lands, warblers of various kinds, rails. So species from across the country and from across different ecosystem types are experiencing these very steep and alarming declines. And some of the reasons why these birds are experiencing declines, depending on what the threat to their particular population might be a diversity of threats, including things like habitat loss, which is truly a threat across the board for bird species across the United States. Insect declines and pesticide use. So if you remember the number that we pointed out for the aerial insectivores, how they're experiencing some major declines. And aerial insectivores include species like the chimney swift, which you see here. The insect declines that are happening across the country, of course, most directly impact species that depend most heavily on insects, which are our insectivores, species that pretty much exclusively eat insects. And of course, pesticide use not only reduces the available food for insect-eating birds, but the toxins themselves can cause declines in birds if consumed and working its way through the food web. Window collisions are actually, depending on how much you know about birds or how much you are already familiar with some of the threats, sometimes a surprising threat for people to learn about. Because of the way that windows work, humans put windows in place, but unless you built those windows, you may not recognize that they're there, particularly if they're not visible. And about up to 1 billion birds die each year from colliding into windows. And we see a lot of those deaths happening during migration, unfortunately. And then climate change, which is impacting everyone and everything, is causing a lot of threats that already exist to birds to be multiplied. So in places that have already been struggling, say with droughts, those droughts will intensify and be longer. You're thinking about coastal communities of wildlife and people, species like various coastal sparrows, like salt marsh sparrows and seaside sparrows. Sea level rise is literally engulfing their habitat and causing nest flooding and some of the direct causes of mortality, so to speak, for these animals. And so there are a diversity of threats to birds, and some of these may seem out of reach depending on the scope of the threat, right? There are windows that we have no control over, right? Climate change is something that we all have to be on board to address, but there is a lot that individual people, no matter how much control you have over the space around you, can actually do to alleviate some of these threats. And just to give you an idea, the birds that are facing threats aren't birds that are kind of way out, in places far away from where we live. The reason why I love the chimney swift as an example so much is because chimney swifts are frequently found, particularly in the more eastern half of the United States, pretty densely in some city areas. And so this is a picture just of their range across the United States, and they are migratory. And if I zoom in on my city, which is Atlanta, Georgia, the darker the purple, the higher the density of chimney swifts, or the highest number of reported, I should say, chimney swifts. And Atlanta is a very much a built environment, and chimney swifts actually do rely on a lot of built structures like chimneys, for example. But despite the fact that they are found pretty abundantly, so to speak, in city environments, they are facing a lot of these issues: habitat loss. The chimneys even that they have relied on for many decades are getting capped and disappearing. Before they were chimneys, they relied on really large dead trees to roost in, right? Those don't really exist anymore in nearly the number that they used to. And again, those insect declines from pesticide use are very much a constant threat. So thinking about these various threats to birds, what can someone like us do who have decision-making power over some space, no matter how small or large, whether you just have a balcony or a deck, or you have many, many acres of land? There are ways that you can make your space as safe for birds as possible, and to advocate for their conservation at levels that are above kind of the individual action level. So number one, it's really important, not just for the big skyscrapers with windows, but also for the residential homes to have bird-safe windows. A huge a percentage of window collisions that happen actually do happen on residential homes. And so making your windows bird safe, I'll be putting a link to that in the chat so that you can have access to resources to give you an idea of what those options might look like for your home. Some of them are really cute and aesthetic, so you don't have to worry about changing the look of your house too much. Planting native plants to attract the birds and the wildlife that they depend on, and we'll be touching a little bit more on that in a few minutes. But native plants are really important for kind of many dimensions, all dimensions of the lives of birds. Reducing your use of pesticides. So if you are a gardener and you have control over some amount of green space, we want to reduce the amount of pesticides that are making it into the environment, because they are not just restricted to the place where we spray them or place them. They get into our soil, they get into our waterways, and they impact birds and other wildlife and people far away from where we actually may live. And when it comes to advocacy, I say this is so important, right? We need a combination of personal action, so people taking the place where they live and making it as bird friendly as possible, providing birds with what they need to survive, thrive, reproduce. But we also need to see action happening on a scale larger than the dimension in which we operate day to day. We need our legislators, elected officials locally, elected officials all the way up in Congress, making decisions that require industries and people who have power over large spaces where birds are occupying, to be acting on behalf of birds and other wildlife. And a really great opportunity to do that is currently underway, literally as we speak, is Recovering America's Wildlife Act. This is a bill that we've been working on, and many organizations and people have been working on for a couple of Congresses now, at least. There's a whole history even prior to that. But it has, in this 118th Congress, recently been introduced in the Senate. And so what we're doing is we are asking people to call their senators and say, please support the Recovering America's Wildlife Act, because this bill is actually going to provide substantial amounts of money for state agencies and tribal nations to do conservation actions that they already have the plans for, they just need the money for. And so this will benefit birds greatly, especially those that have been experiencing some of the steepest declines. That's my answer, and I'll go ahead now and pass it back to our hosts.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Corina. That was awesome. And John, Corina touched a little bit on plants. Well, she touched on a lot of amazing things there. But I think wanted to ask you specifically about plants and also like what else we can do to create habitat, kind of looking at maybe a layered approach. Are there different things that we can do to really create the ideal habitat to make a bird friendly environment and address some of these issues that Corina was sharing?
Sure. Well, I like to start out talking about how birds reflect the habitats that are out there on the landscape, and how the birds reflect the habitats. I can go into a particular habitat. I could be shown a picture of a particular habitat, and I could probably tell you in that forest, these are the birds that you would expect to see there in the springtime making their nests. Or you could give me a audio quiz of birds, and I could tell you from knowing what birds are in a particular area, what the surrounding trees and other vegetation look like, because birds reflect the habitats that we find across really across the globe. Anything from alpine meadow areas to what we call riparian forests, those next to rivers and streams. Different forest types, different habitat types all reflect birds are very adaptable to these various habitat types and are reflected by those habitat types in their adaptations. And I combine this into what I refer to as ornithology. Ornithology is an ornithologist is somebody who studies birds. An ecologist is somebody who studies where animals and plants live and why. And I do both. So I think that it's important to think about how well birds reflect the environment that they're in. If I could have the next one. Corina brought up in her slides the plight kind of the grassland bird species, and so if we think about, if we're looking across, looking out our airplane window, or looking out across the highway as we drive along, and you see field and forest, maybe some lakes and ponds and wetlands, they're all reflective of different birds that are adapted to living in them. Some are very particular about the habitats that they live in. These are examples of birds that live in fields and meadows, or what we refer to as grassland birds. Upland sandpipers, like you have up on the right there, bobolinks down on the lower left, in the meadowlark, which Corina spoke about earlier. And then within those habitats, birds select for variety in the structure, as Mary was saying. How are these layers important? And if we could go to the next slide. So if you think about your typical forest, if you went into an area of old Christmas trees that had just grown up, and you had a bunch of evergreen trees kind of shading out anything on the ground, you have a pretty sterile environment for birds. But if you have an area that's got, well, it's got some maple trees and oak trees and some other deciduous trees and hemlocks and some pine trees in it. It's got some dead down logs and low growing shrubs. Within the forest, birds depend on different parts